They tried to erase these survival tricks from history, and not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well. Imagine living in the Middle Ages, no hospitals, no supermarkets, no electricity, yet somehow peasants survived plagues, brutal winters, and starvation with hacks so effective that some were later banned or suppressed. Why? What did they know that we forgot? First, fire that never dies. Medieval villagers mastered something called the perpetual hearth. Instead of relighting fires every day, they buried slow-burning embers under ash, keeping heat alive for weeks. Sounds simple, right? But in cities like London, authorities restricted open hearth techniques after devastating urban fires. A survival trick became a crime. Then there was the famine bread secret. During crop failures across regions like France, peasants mixed tree bark flour and wild herbs into bread. It sounds desperate. It sounds disgusting. But modern researchers now admit some of those wild plants had antimicrobial properties. In other words, they weren't just filling their stomachs, they were fighting infection. So why did officials later outlaw bark mixing? Because mills and grain taxes funded the crown. When people stopped depending on taxed wheat, power structures felt threatened. Survival became rebellion. And here's the twist. Medieval communities used controlled fasting as a health reset, not for religion alone, but to survive scarcity cycles. Long before biohackers on podcasts talked about intermittent fasting, villages were already doing it out of necessity. Records from monasteries tied to Catholic Church show strict fasting calendars that accidentally improved metabolic health, but when famine panic hit, some rulers forced grain consumption to stabilize markets. Even your hunger was regulated. Think that's shocking? Wait until you hear about the cold in northern settlements near Norway. Families built semi-underground homes, trapping geothermal warmth, smart insulation, minimal fuel. Yet later urban reforms labeled such housing primitive and banned them in expanding cities. People were pushed into stone buildings that looked modern but were colder and deadlier in winter. Why replace what worked? Because appearance of progress mattered more than survival. And then there's the herbal knowledge. Village healers, mostly women, carried plant wisdom passed down for generations. Yarrow for wounds, garlic for infection, honey as antiseptic. We laugh at old wives' tales, yet during outbreaks, like the Black Death, some isolated rural communities using herbal fumigation at lower mortality rates. Coincidence? Maybe. But as centralized medicine rose, many traditional practices were condemned as superstition. Knowledge burned with the accusations. Now here's the emotional punch. Medieval peasants survived not because life was easy, but because community was tight. Shared ovens, shared labor, shared food stores. In some English villages outside York, communal granaries prevented starvation during harsh winters. Later, privatization policies dismantled common land systems. Shared survival became private struggle, and today we call their methods primitive. Yet scientists now study fermentation, fasting, cold adaptation, herbal antimicrobials, rediscovering what villagers practiced out of necessity. Sauerkraut, bone broth, ash preservation. These weren't trends. They were life-saving systems. So ask yourself, if these hacks were useless, why were they restricted? Why were commons enclosed? Why were healers silenced? Maybe the real shock isn't that medieval people were ignorant. Maybe the shock is that they were resourceful beyond measure. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful survival tools were never lost, only forgotten. Because in a world obsessed with convenience, the old ways feel inconvenient. But when crisis hits, food shortages, energy cuts, supply chain breaks, whose methods will actually work? The banned ones. The simple ones, the community-driven ones, the ember under ash, the bread from bark, the home built into earth. History doesn't just tell us how they lived. It whispers how to survive when systems fail. And the biggest secret, they weren't waiting for rescue. They became resilient. And resilience wasn't just about food or fire. It was about seeing opportunity where others saw doom. Imagine a winter so cold that rivers froze solid in Prague, yet villagers turned ice into survival tools. They harvested frozen fish stored in naturally insulated pits, wrapped in straw, eating fresh protein months after the rivers froze. Authorities later banned some of these practices, claiming it was unsanitary, but those communities survived when cities starved. Then there were the hidden water hacks. In plague-stricken towns, clean water was scarce and wells often contaminated. Peasants discovered that running water filtered through sand and charcoal removed bacteria better than stagnant ponds. Centuries before science would explain filtration, some lords forbade digging private wells, fearing loss of tax revenue. Every survival gain was a threat to power. And the psychological edge, medieval people had rituals that kept hope alive. Storytelling by fires wasn't just entertainment. It reinforced memory of safe routes, edible plants, and trusted neighbors. Games, songs, chants. They were survival manuals disguised as culture. Skip the stories. Skip survival. Then comes the outlawed mobility trick. Temporary forests and ghost villages. People rotated farmland and pastures seasonally, letting land recover naturally while evading taxes and feudal obligations. This made them invisible to revenue collectors, but later reforms labeled it theft of crown land. Imagine losing your freedom to farm simply because you survived smartly. And here's the kicker. Plague masks weren't just superstition. Early designs used aromatic herbs to filter air. Science confirmed some actually reduced airborne bacteria. Governments later banned homemade masks during urban expansions because they interfered with trade regulations and authority. Even breathing safety became political. The ultimate reveal, all these hacks, food, fire, shelter, herbal remedies, water, mobility, mental strategies, weren't pre-imitative. They were sophisticated systems built from observation, trial, and necessity. Modern survival influences, they've just repackaged what medieval peasants practiced for generations. And while history paints them as powerless, the truth is shocking. Those who adapted thrived, and those who obeyed blindly didn't. So next time you think survival is about gadgets or apps, remember this. The banned hacks of medieval times were more effective than most modern conveniences. Ember under ash, bark bread, fermented foods, herbal antiseptics, underground homes, ice storage, sand-filtered water. These weren't hacks, they were lifelines. And the lesson? Survival isn't about following rules. It's about understanding nature, community, and human ingenuity. If we ever face a world without grids, without supply chains, without help, the answers are already waiting in history's forbidden pages. And those who pay attention now, they'll survive. Those who scroll past, history has already shown their fate. And here's where it gets even more mind-blowing. The medieval world wasn't just surviving scarcity. It was innovating in ways we're only now rediscovering. Take fermentation. Not just for taste, but for preservation and nutrition. Villagers in regions like Germany turned cabbage into sauerkraut, milk into cheese, and grains into sourdough, creating probiotics that strengthened immunity. Modern science calls it gut health, but they called it survival. And then there's fire ingenuity. Beyond the perpetual hearth, some peasants used smoke traps to dry meat and herbs efficiently, while simultaneously keeping insects and vermin away. These techniques were banned in cities after accidental fires. Yet rural communities thrived with them for decades. Now consider mobility under threat. Travelers and merchants relied on hidden waypoints, marked trees, subtle stone markers, seker, et paths, to avoid highwaymen and taxing lords. Think GPS, but handmade, organic, and encrypted, in plain sight. Many of these secret paths were later destroyed or made illegal when borders were formalized and lands privatized. And don't forget medicine. Herbal poultices, teas, and fumigations, banned as witchcraft, actually had compounds modern chemistry now confirms as antibacterial and antifungal. During plagues and infections, those who had access to these forbidden remedies survived far better than those relying solely on centralized medicine. Then comes the social survival secret. Communities pooled resources, knowledge, and labor strategically. In Florence, historical records show common granaries and cooperative work schedules that ensured no one starved while maximizing efficiency. When authorities dissolved these systems, death rates spiked. Here's the twist that hits hardest. Medieval survival wasn't just physical. Psychological resilience was engineered into daily life. Storytelling, songs, rituals, even humor around hardship. These weren't fluff. They were life support, memory aids, and stress relievers all at once. Every band hack, fire, food, water, shelter, medicine, community, mobility, mental strategies, was a lesson in adaptive thinking. And the ultimate reveal? The medieval world wasn't primitive. It was a survival laboratory. And when modern crises hit, pandemics, blackouts, supply chain collapse, those who study these band hacks will be the ones thriving. Ember under ash, fermented foods, buried ice, herbal remedies, hidden paths, communal granaries. They aren't relics, they're a blueprint. History didn't just forget them. Powerful forces tried to erase them. But now, the knowledge is here again, waiting. And the final, shocking truth: survival has always been a choice. To adapt, to observe, to outsmart. Those who do, they live. Those who don't, history has already written their fate. And now, the secret no history book dares to admit: the medieval hacks weren't just survival tools. They were power. Every ember kept alive, every loaf of bark bread, every hopal poultice, every hidden path. These weren't just ways to live, they were ways to resist control. Authorities banned them not because they were dangerous to health, but because they were dangerous to power. People who mastered these hacks became invisible to rulers, untouchable by taxes, plagues, and famine. And here's the mind-bending part. Modern science is catching up and confirming what they already knew. Intermittent fasting, they did it to survive scarcity. Fermented foods, they strengthened immunity. Cold exposure, they thrived in winters we'd call brutal. Hidden water filtration, they avoided disease. Every primitive to seize, every primitive trick was actually genius. So ask yourself, if these banned hacks worked then, why aren't we using them now? Because convenience replaced resilience, rules replaced observation, systems replaced self-reliance. But the knowledge still exists. It's buried in old manuscripts, in folk tales, in ancestral memory. And those who rediscover it, who pay attention, who experiment, who adapt, they don't just survive, they thrive when everything else collapses. Imagine a world where food runs out, fires can't be lit, hospitals shut down. The people who followed medieval wisdom wouldn't just cope, they'd dominate. And that's the shocking truth. History tried to hide. The banned survival hacks weren't dangerous to life. They were dangerous to authority. Ember under ash bark bread, herbal medicine, underground homes, secret paths, community granaries. They weren't just hacks, they were freedom. And here's the final question for you. When the next crisis hits, will you follow the rules and risk failing? Or will you remember the forbidden wisdom that kept humans alive for centuries? The choice isn't hypothetical. History has already answered it. And now, so can you.